Welcome to Embargoed, a podcast featuring intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I am one of your hosts, Brian Fleming, and I'm here on this sunny but cold Friday morning with my friend, colleague, and co-host, Mr. Timothy O'Toole. What is up, Tim?
I'm very happy that nothing happened yesterday on Capitol Hill. March did not turn out like January 6th. So sunny and cold, I'll take it. Quiet is what I really like.
Yeah, for those who weren't tracking, there was a threat of perhaps another attack yesterday that came and went. Thankfully, with nothing came of that. All is quiet, all is peaceful. We're very grateful for that. And here we are. Tim is ensconced in his hideaway on Capitol Hill, recording this episode, and no worse for wear, thankfully. So welcome to everybody to the latest episode of Embargoed. Appreciate you being with us. This is a mini landmark. This is our 25th episode that we have recorded, which is pretty cool.
That's impressive.
We've done 25 in almost exactly a year. We've been at this for just over a year now. Of course, our last episode, we want to thank again Sue Millar and Tom Stalker for joining us. That was a lot of fun. We've gotten a lot of good feedback, and we're happy to say that our discussion and Tom's prognostication about the lifting of the whiskey tariffs came true. So, just to anybody out there who
we
wants
have
to
made a
wildly
difference,
speculate,
Brian. We have made a difference, and Tom in particular.
We are a pro whiskey podcast. In case anybody is not,
we don't like to take strong positions, but pro whiskey.
We're pro whiskey.
How can you be against whiskey?
Exactly. So that did just happen the other day. The U.S. lifted the tariffs on Scotch whiskey. But no, thank you again to Sue and Tom. That was a lot of fun. As we've said, I think that has. Not that we needed convincing, but I think we are resolved that we are definitely going to have more guests and more friends on from around the world to talk about what they are seeing in their particular corners of the globe. And so look out for that in upcoming episodes. But today we are back to kind of our normal format. There's a lot that's happened in the last few weeks. We're going to cover a few things that actually predated the recording of the last episode that we just didn't have time to get to, and a few things that have come up in the last couple of weeks. So we will jump right in just a moment. So dispense with the normal introductory notes. We're not here giving legal advice. We're not discussing confidential information. If you don't like what we have to say, even if it has to do with whiskey, blame me and Tim. No one else is to blame. And as always, please, you can find us anywhere: Apple, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, Overcast, YouTube. If you like the pod, please check us out. Please subscribe. Please give us hopefully a 5-star rating. And we will be back, of course, every 2 weeks. And we're recording this on Friday, March 5th. This should be up in the middle of next week, probably on Wednesday. I think with that, we're ready to jump into the roadmap. So we have topic number 1, not China, thankfully, for a change.
When you look at the outline, one of the things that has changed pretty dramatically with the Biden administration is that there's lots of topics to talk about, and none of them really involve China.
More diversity of topics. That's not to say that China is not still a front burner issue. It is. Well, we have one sort of China topic in the lightning round, but we're going to start with Russia. We're going to start with the actions the U.S. took earlier this week, directly related to the poisoning of Aleksey Navalny and his imprisonment in Russia, and use that as kind of a broader an excuse to sort of just talk more broadly about U.S. and Russia and what's already happened and what's coming in the likely in the next few weeks or months. Then we're going to pivot to Iran, and we're going to, as our other big prognostication from our guest the last time was Sue, of course, predicted JCPOA 2.0 in the next 12 to 15 months. We have sort of at least the first ripples in that direction to talk about and to assess. So we'll talk about Iran. Then we're going to pivot to Burma, Myanmar, and what's happening there, and unfortunately the sort of worsening of the post-coup situation in Burma and what the U.S. and the UN may do about that. We're going to give a brief comment also about Yemen because we've been tracking the reversal on U.S. policy with Yemen, but there were a couple of designations this past week, so we'll just comment on that quickly, and then we're going to wrap up the main portion with a recent OFAC settlement relating to BitPay, and we'll just cover that quickly because I think there's a couple of interesting things to point out there. And then in the lightning round, we're going to cover, this is really our China topic, which is the ICTS Supply Chain interim final rule, which apparently is here to stay, according to some comments that have come out from the Commerce Department. We'll touch on that very briefly, and then we're going to end with a few words and thoughts on the U.S. Cuba Trade Act, which was introduced a few weeks ago by Senator Wyden, and we'll reflect on that and talk about that and maybe handicap whether we think that has any chance of going anywhere at this point. And that'll be our show for today. So as Tim said, we're led on China. We have lots of interesting, diverse topics to talk about. So we are going to jump right in. So topic number one, Aleksey Navalny and Russia. So I think everybody has been fully expecting that, and we have discussed at length the idea that the U.S. approach to Russia was about to change and that the gloves were going to come off and there was going to be some more aggressive action taken for a variety of reasons and on a variety of fronts. And so I think this is really the first signal that is in fact going to be the approach. And earlier this week, we saw sanctions, or really we saw a number of actions, and I'll sort of catalog all of this quickly and then turn it to Tim for some initial reactions. So we saw, so OFAC levied some sanctions against some members of the Russian government under one of the Ukraine EOs under 13661. The State Department issued some sanctions under COTSA Section 231. The 231E list was added to, there were about 5 or 6 entities, I think half a dozen entities that were added to the 231E list for being part of the defense or intelligence sector of the Russian Federation. And then there were some additional sanctions that were levied under the WMD authorities, because of course, to refresh everybody's recollection, the Navalny attack was a nerve agent that was used there, which is restricted under international law, and so that was so there were some WMD sanctions that were levied as well under 13382, Executive Order 13382, and then another big one, or perhaps in some ways the biggest one, is there was another set of sanctions that were levied under the CBW Act, the Chemical and Biological Weapons Act. Now, some of these were waived, but this affects foreign assistance to Russia, arms sales to Russia, arms sale financing, U.S. government extension of credit, and exports of national security sensitive goods and technologies, so things that are NS controlled under the Commerce Department list. Russia was also now officially, it was announced that they are officially going to be added to the ITAR 126.1 list, which is a big deal because they have not been on that list, and that is obviously a restriction in terms of sales of military items to Russia. And it seems that it is going to be toward the most restrictive end of the spectrum. There are going to be some grandfathering in for space-related sales and items and exports, but otherwise it's going to be a pretty comprehensive bar to those types of sales to Russia. So a lot of activity, again, all kind of flowing from the Navalny poisoning and then his subsequent imprisonment upon his return to Russia. So let me just stop there. There's much more to talk about, I think, here, and there's much more coming, I believe. But let me just pause there and throw it to you, Tim, sort of in terms of what we saw this week. What are your responses to that? What are your immediate reactions? How do we think this is going to sort of play out from here?
So I think it's nice to start and look at this from 50,000 feet to just kind of see where we were when this sanction went into place, right? Russia was already sanctioned based on its actions in the Ukraine. CATSA was passed that provided all sorts of sanctions authorities. And in the wake of that, last October, I believe it was, the Russian government, by all accounts, and the U.S. concluded this almost right away, just like the rest of the world did. They poisoned the chief member of the opposition. So basically, just a horrendous act. And the U.S.
on foreign soil, by the way.
On foreign soil.
On foreign soil, yeah.
Okay. So a pretty shocking and horrendous and very brazen act by a country that was already either under a bunch of sanctions and or subject to a bunch of sanctions authorities. And the U.S. response at the time of the previous administration was to do nothing. Unlike the rest of Europe, certainly the rest of our allies took a different response, although without the U.S., it was relatively inconsequential. And so U.S. sanctions policy towards Russia until very recently was so weak that it didn't even do anything about this. Now, it's not surprising to me that one of the first things that the Biden administration does coming in, where they said that they were going to change the tune regarding Russia, is that they impose sanctions for this, because this is, the golf equivalent of a 6-inch putt. It is the easy thing to do. It's the obvious thing to do, and it's one you almost can't miss when you do it. In terms of the change in Russian behavior, I think this is a very inconsequential sanction. In terms of the change in the U.S. behavior, I think it's a very big sanction, not only because it actually makes clear now that Russia is not going to be able to do these sorts of things without some sort of response from the U.S., but also I think it's a return to the coordination with the EU that took place from 2014 to the beginning of 2017 with respect to Russia sanctions that really went away for most of the last 4 years. So I think the approach to Russia is going to look similar now to what it did in the 2014 to 2017 era. But I'm not sure that it says a lot with respect to what's going to go forward with respect to Russia, because this isn't very big and it wasn't very hard to do. It doesn't tell me much about whether the Biden administration is going to go beyond this and really try and change Russian behavior, or whether this is just purely symbolic.
Yeah, so I agree with that. I don't know that this is going to have much of a splash or much of an impact, sort of as a practical matter. But I will say a couple of things to pick up on some points you made. Number one, I think the messaging around this, that this now aligns the U.S. with what European partners did, again, late last year, I think that's important. And I think, as we've been saying and as we've been expecting and as we are now seeing, 6 weeks into the new administration, this idea of a multilateral approach, of a multi-front approach with respect to high priorities on a sanctions and foreign policy basis, whether it be certainly Russia. We talked about this a lot with Burma and Myanmar. We'll come back to that. That is the preferred approach here, is that we don't want to go it alone. We want to be aligned with our allies, and we want to hopefully prompt them to act, because that's, in all likelihood, the way that you're going to actually get changes in behavior. So I think that's notable there. I will say, though, that so you are correct. I think that we're back to probably a more aggressive approach on Russia, or this is maybe the first step or baby step toward a more aggressive approach on Russia, although this particular set of actions doesn't amount to too much in the grand scheme. One thing that, almost, as we've talked about before, almost by accident, we believe that the prior administration did, that actually had some consequences, was throw a number of the oligarchs and some of the companies that they own and control on the SDN list. That when that happened in April 2018, after then Secretary Mnuchin basically made some representations to the effect that, oh no, we're going to take that seriously and we're going to do something about that in front of Congress, and then those designations came out, that definitely changed behavior among a bunch of factions of the global economy that had a lot of business in Russia or with those entities, right, or with those parties. I think that if the U.S. is really looking to inflict some pain and to ratchet up pressure in a way that could be meaningful. I think there is clearly another wave or two or three that could be targeted in that same vein that we just have not gone there yet. And so I think that in the back of your mind, in the back of everybody's mind, I think we should be thinking about, could we see another wave of oligarch designations and the companies again they own and control? Because I think that would have a big impact and would potentially, depending on sort of what sectors we're targeting, what companies we're targeting, what individuals we're targeting. So that hasn't happened yet. I don't know that it will happen, but I think that is, I've seen a number of people kind of point to, well, that's kind of in the toolkit or in the playbook, and the U.S. could play that card. We haven't yet. So
yeah, I mean, that was some of the
about.
reporting around that talked about how, that the U.S. could have gone further and that they hadn't really designated any oligarchs. And I think that you're exactly right, that what the April 2018 designations showed was that Russia is relatively vulnerable to targeted sanctions if the U.S. decides that that's where it wants to go. And in fact, I think they were more vulnerable and there was a more disruption to the global economy than even OFAC anticipated at the time.
Right, by sort of their own account. I also think that, though, that this also reveals that what we should be anticipating, sort of looking more broadly and sort of extrapolating from this, the idea that this administration and this iteration of the OFAC and the State Department in terms of implementing and imposing these sanctions wants to be incremental. They don't necessarily want to go with the big splashy move right off the bat. The declare, maximum pressure. We're now just, emptying firing every bullet we have at this problem or at this target. I think that is the opposite of the way that this administration wants to act. They want to build slowly and build by consensus and build multilaterally, and perhaps get to bigger, more consequential actions and sanctions over time. But I don't think that it's their inclination to do that right away, which, quite frankly, leaves them leverage and leaves them room to grow. Because if you sort of declare that you've just imposed the most, powerful, consequential sanctions on somebody sort of on day one, you don't have a lot more. You can, is it maximum pressure plus, or is it maximum pressure? Or that's kind of where we were by the end of the Trump administration. Is like everything was. It was super maximum ultimate pressure that was being put on in some of these programs. And I don't think that's the approach that we should expect to see here. But there is a lot more that can be done. And I think that actually ties to the next point that we want to hit on, which is there have been some signals and some comments made by top officials in the Biden administration that there will certainly be something coming in the near future on at least the SolarWinds attack and the sort of massive hack into U.S. government systems that has been only publicly known now for several months, but has been ongoing at least for a year or more, according to some reports. So I think there's certainly a hint that more will be coming there. I think that is going to be in all likelihood another wave of sanctions. However, they're hinting that there's going to be more to that. So whether that means affirmative cyber operations or something else, I don't know. But I think this is just, again, Navalny is kind of the beginning. I think there's more coming. We have there's the cyber EO, there's the Russia-Ukraine EOs. There's a lot of tools on the sanction side. And then I think there's a lot of other things that the government is kind of considering right now as well.
Yeah, I mean, that talk about 50,000 foot, looking at U.S. Russia relations, and Russia conducts what the U.S. concluded was a massive coordinated cyber attack against the U.S. government. I mean, we imposed sanctions against Russia because it attacked Ukraine. I mean, and we did nothing, again, despite the fact that it attacked the U.S. government. And so something is coming on that score. And to the extent that it is proportional to the injury, we'll see. And I agree with you that it may not be sanctions. I mean, I've read comments that from on the record comments from current government officials that suggest that it will not necessarily be something that anybody ever finds out about, which suggests to me there may be some sort of cyber counterattack coming.
I think that's likely. I think it's probably going to be a combination of things that we're going to see, and some of which will be publicly disclosed and acknowledged, and some of which likely will not be. And so that I think is coming. There's also the issue of the latest round of election interference coming out of Russia, and what might be done there, and when we may see some action there. I think that's sort of in the same, kind of in the same boat with the massive the SolarWinds attack as well, and we'll likely see some action there in the near future, as well. So I think this is just getting start. U.S. just getting started with respect to Russia. I think we're gonna see much more in the coming months. I think this raises sort of to end on one interesting question, which was actually came up in a conversation I was having just earlier today. I think this again we're in agreement. I don't know that these latest actions kind of amount to anything that's going to be terribly consequential for in terms of disruption in Russia itself. However, I think there may be some reassessment, reevaluation on the part of companies, perhaps in Europe and other parts of the world that do business in Russia, um, sort of just thinking about how risky it is to kind of be in that market, just kind of full stop, right? I mean, I think Russia is obviously, from a U.S. perspective, I think deemed to be or thought to be a higher risk jurisdiction because of sanctions, because of corruption, because of AML risk, all of those things, right? However, if we're maybe embarking on a new, more aggressive, sanctions export control landscape, does that mean that now Russia is elevated to a level where maybe not to the embargoed countries, but maybe just a notch below that or so? And our companies or our banks in particular going to say, we just don't do Russia business. We're just not
Right.
worth the risk. The compliance costs are too high. We're just not going to do that. Is this the beginning of kind of creeping up on that reality? And what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that let's see if anything comes of the response to the cyber attack from a sanctions perspective. But I do think that um, there certainly seems to be the will within this administration to use sanctions to actually change behavior with respect to Russia. And quite honestly, if that's the case, the current sanctions have not changed behavior at all. So they're going to need to be increased relatively significantly. And if they are, I definitely think that you will see banks that will start to treat Russia in the same way that they treat the embargoed companies or in embargoed countries or something close to that. Like, for example, you could get to a Venezuela situation, I think, and which is not technically under embargo, but which banks have basically refused to do any transactions there or largely refused to do transactions there just as a matter of risk reduction.
Yeah, no, I agree. So I think that's something to keep an eye on. And I think just based on, again, anecdotally, what we're hearing from clients and colleagues is that, I think there's a keen eye on Russia and sort of how the additional measures may play out and what that means as a sort of secondary consequence for those who are doing business there. So something to certainly keep a close watch on. So with that, let's leave Russia. Let's move to Iran. So the first attempt at getting JCPOA together, not so successful. So what do we see?
Well,
What
yeah.
just
So
happened and what do we
so
see?
so I think that the JCPOA 2.0 negotiations have begun. They've started slowly, but they're underway. And so the U.S. With the Biden administration coming into office, having run on the platform that President Biden was going to rejoin the nuclear deal, the U.S. working with the European allies, again, a new development, but a multilateral approach to Iran. Um, the EU proposed some informal talks between Iran and the U.S. It's prompted by the U.S. To return to the JCPOA, and the news stories were essentially that Iran had said no. But when you read Iran's response carefully, it's not a real no. I mean, the response was considering the recent actions and statements by the US and three European powers, Iran does not consider this the time to hold an informal meeting with these countries, which was proposed by the EU foreign policy chief. that is not really a no. That's like not yet. And that was on Sunday. We're recording on Friday the 5th. This morning, actually, as we were starting to record, I saw that an Iranian official had been interviewed and had given the quote with respect to the negotiations. The quote that I read was, "We have to see every month during the talks that some sanctions which are of urgency to us are being lifted." And I think the message there is that I think behind Iran's rejection / non-rejection is that it does want the U.S. to actually commit to some sanctions lifting before it comes back to the table, because I think in its view, the U.S. was the one that left the deal originally without cause. And so if the U.S. wants to get back into the deal, it's going to have to at least take a unilateral step. Now, that is inconsistent a little bit with what President Biden promised during the campaign, because his promise was we would rejoin the deal if Iran came back into compliance with its nuclear obligations. But again, having come into compliance with its nuclear obligations and then having the rug pulled out from under them, Iran is not inclined to just unilaterally go back into compliance with the deal if the U.S. is not committed to going back into compliance with the deal and formally committed and incentivizing. And so it's going to be a question of who goes first. But I think from the quote that I just read and from the articles that are surrounding it, there's going to be some form of synchronicity. That is, there's going to be synchronized behavior. I think the U.S. is going to have to lift some of the sanctions that were put back into place, and actually some of the sanctions that went beyond what were in the JCPOA, as part of Iran starting to accept going back into its nuclear obligations. And that will happen. I think that I say that the negotiations have begun. I mean, this is part of the negotiation, is kind of who's going to move first, who's going to make the first move, like how is the first meeting going to be conducted. Like this is all about the who gets to set, who gets to determine where the flowers on the platform that the two officials shake hands on is how they're arranged. I think this is all just a big part of the gamesmanship that goes into any negotiation, and that it's underway. And the fact that Iran didn't say, no, we're never going back, but it essentially said, not yet, and then is quoted in the other articles I saw as saying the U.S. needs to make the first move, and the U.S. coming back and saying we're disappointed, but we're going to keep trying to get back into the nuclear deal, tells me this is underway. And I wouldn't read too much into this. And in fact, in some sense, I would suggest that this is a positive step, because it means the parties are talking and nobody's walking away from the table. And in fact, nobody's saying anything like they're thinking about walking away from the table. They're just posturing.
Yeah, I think that's right. I agree. I think it is actually a positive step. This kind of initial rejection and everything that's kind of surrounding it, and the discourse around it. They're sort of negotiating about. They're negotiating in public, perhaps even in private, about what's the old joke of like, well, we're negotiating about the size and shape of the table and who sits where,
exactly.
And like you said about where that's kind of what's happening now. Who sets the terms of what this will be? That's a bit there. I think a fascinating question is kind of what you spent a bit of time talking about, which is what would the U.S. be willing to sort of give up preliminarily as a sign of good faith to get them fully back to the table? Would it be, the kind of unilateral arms embargo that was announced when the UN arms embargo expired last year? Would it be, some of the additional financial institution sanctions or financial sector sanctions we saw last year? Could it be some of the other industries that were targeted for sanctions after the kind of initial wave in 2018? This maybe slightly less strategically important, but still, important sources of revenue for the Iranian government than, kind of oil and gas and those core industries. What is that going to be? How much is the U.S. going to be willing to give without kind of any assurances? I don't have great answers to that. I don't really know. And I think the U.S., of course, has to be mindful of a couple of things. Obviously, one is I don't think from a pure negotiation tactic standpoint, they're not going to be presumably falling all over themselves to kind of give away all the leverage that they have and all of the the sort of things that they have to bargain if they want to hopefully get a better deal in JCPOA 2.0 than they got the first time around. And second, it's the sort of political calculus here, which is this is any kind of a deal, any kind of a version 2.0 is going to have heavy resistance from certain pockets of certainly the U.S., certainly in Congress and other parts of just kind of the U.S. electorate. And so, how does the Biden administration try to manage that? I mean, I hate to even say this, but we're only 18 months away, essentially 20 months away from the next national election in the United States, and how things move along and what the timeline is, and how that might impact things, and the standing and the prospects of people who are going to either be supporting or denouncing this is going to play into this. And so I think we're going to have to see how that plays out as well.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree that essentially, the U.S. on the one hand doesn't want to look weak in these negotiations. On the other hand, it does have to recognize that any counterparty, including Iran, whatever you think of Iran, would be very skeptical of a negotiation with somebody who's saying, okay, so we had this deal and we walked out on the deal without provocation whatsoever, and against the essentially kicking and screaming of our allies, or of the other parties to the deal, including the ones on our side. And now we've changed our mind and we're back. So we want you to do all of the things that you were supposed to do under the deal first, and then we'll come back into the deal. Like, nobody would ever take that. And so it's not surprising that Iran wouldn't. On the other hand, from a political standpoint, I don't think that the Biden administration can sit down at the table without some assurance that Iran will be back into compliance with its nuclear obligations as part of the end game, and some commitment that that is really part of the end game. And so, I mean, that's why I talk about the synchronicity or simultaneous measures. I think what's going to happen now is they're going to negotiate the terms of the negotiation. So basically, before we sit down, you have to agree, U.S., that you will, if we make this much progress by this date, these sanctions will be lifted. And you, Iran, have to agree that you will make this much progress by this date on, reducing the level of your nuclear program that can be verified by the international authorities. And then by that date, you'll have to get to here. And that's kind of that essentially the drawdown has to be negotiated as part of the terms of the rest of the negotiations taking place, so that nobody shows up at the table with having caved to the other side before they got there. And I think that's really right. what this game is going to look like at this point.
Yeah, just in terms of sort of an optics and domestic political necessity, I think that's right on both sides. So yeah, we'll see how this plays out. I think it's just it obviously made quite a bit of news earlier in the week that this had happened, so we felt like we had to touch on it. And we will, I'm certain, be back to talk more about possible JCPOA 2.0 in the future. So with that, let's go to what seems to be, unfortunately now, the sort of a stalwart segment on Embargoed, which is the military coup portion of Embargoed. And topic number 3, which is, let's go to Myanmar, Burma, for a moment. So we covered on the last episode the new executive order that was put in place by the U.S. and the initial wave of sanctions that were targeted, as we said, largely at the military leads of the coup and a couple of entities that they control. Unfortunately, I'm sure, as most, if not all of you are aware, the situation in Myanmar is getting fairly desperate and getting worse. We did note, I think, in the initial discussion we had, that this was a largely bloodless coup. Well, that is not the case any longer. Just about every day there are more reports coming about violent responses to protesters, pro-democracy protesters in the streets. The report I saw from earlier this week was, at least several dozen protesters have been killed by the military and their proxies earlier this week. And so, I think this is unfortunately escalating in a way that is somewhat sadly predictable, but I think begs the question, again, back to where we were just discussing on Russia, which is the changing behavior. What do we think? And I should add as well, there has been no formal action taken by the UN or by many or really any other bodies that I'm aware of beyond what the US has done. As I think we said, the EU already has existing authorities to go after Myanmar, Burma that remained in place even after the democratic government took hold a few years ago. So I think the question is, what is the next move here? What may we see? And recall, for those who haven't studied it that closely, the Burma EO, the new Burma EO on the U.S. side, it is quite broad. There's a lot that can be done. There's a lot of room to maneuver. There's a lot of ways the U.S. could target this. But as we said at the time, query how much U.S. Action alone is going to change any kind of behavior. I think I saw a report earlier this week that the military leaders in Myanmar are basically on the record saying, like, come at us with everything you have. And I think they were directing these comments toward the UN. We're prepared to weather sanctions. We don't care. We're back in control of our country. We know what's best. We're not yielding, and we don't really care what you try to do to us. It's not going to have any impact. So query whether that would be the case if these if things are if sanctions do go into effect that have some impact and are in place for years perhaps. But what do we make of that, and where do we think the U.S. specifically needs to or should potentially go from here on Myanmar?
Yeah. So sanctions are not a solution for everything. And unfortunately, in the recent past, and I'm not just saying the last 4 years, I think even longer than that, they have been kind of the preferred option because they're viewed as kind of a bloodless way to express your disapproval of some sort of foreign policy action. But Myanmar, when you look at Myanmar, it's I wouldn't say sanctions proof, but it's very resistant to sanctions because it does not have an economy that is dependent upon a single industry. And it's not really all that tied to the U.S. And so its ability to survive sanctions is relatively good. Now, world sanctions, if the UN gets involved, does this become a different issue? Maybe, but again, when you don't have just an economy that's based on one usually natural resource, oil, you become much more resistant to sanctions because it becomes very hard to shut down a whole economy. You can shut down one product easier than you can shut down an economy. So I think at the end of the day, I'd seen some reports where the U.S. is also pursuing kind of some of the regional powers, particularly India, to potentially take a role in trying to change Myanmar's behavior. And this might be a situation where diplomacy is kind of a better tool than sanctions. And certainly, both of them are better tools than the military, because I obviously think this is not a situation that is going to have a military solution either. And so we'll see. The generals hold power in Myanmar, and they have now shown that they're willing to shed blood to keep it, and they are not particularly susceptible to sanctions, and talk about being willing to ride it out. I'm not particularly optimistic based on what we're seeing publicly. Maybe there's something better going on behind closed doors that we don't know about, but we'll find out later.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I think we're still very early day. I mean, we're only a month removed from the coup actually occurring, and I think this is going to be evolving heavily in the next few months. One interesting point, again, that was brought to mind by a conversation I had earlier this week is it will be interesting to see if other, obviously you reference India and other regional forces there, to the extent that there are European nations also that have closer ties to Myanmar historically than the U.S. does. Interested to see whether perhaps they feel compelled to get involved to some extent, whether on the diplomatic side or the sanction side, whether they feel a need to. And I think to the extent they have companies who maybe have a bigger footprint in Myanmar, that could be something that we see more of in the coming months as there's maybe tough choices that need to be made about staying or going, those types of things. So that's another thing to keep an eye on. One sort of quasi-related topic that I wanted to mention, that we wanted to mention very briefly before moving on to our last topic, is Yemen, because we have talked about Yemen quite a bit, and we talked obviously about the very quick reversal that the Biden administration had with respect to the last days of the Trump administration in designating the Ansarallah as a foreign terrorist organization and imposing some sanctions under OFAC's global terrorism authorities. That all went away, as we discussed on the most recent episode. However, just this week, there were a couple of Ansarallah leaders that were sanctioned. They were added to the SDN list under the Yemen sanctions authorities, which are in place just for Yemen, not necessarily flowing from the counterterrorism or the global terrorism sanctions program. And they were sort of called out for destabilizing activities and other things in the region, attacking commercial vessels, disrupting bordering nations, a number of things like that. And in particular, I thought it was interesting because there was reference in the press release to sort of advancing Iran's agenda and sort of destabilizing the country in that part of in that region as well. So I think the only real point I think to be made here is, even though we've seen sort of that big blanket kind of maximum pressure approach has been completely eradicated with respect to Yemen, this is kind of a perfect pivot to the kind of more targeted, surgical, nuanced approach that I think we expected to see from the Biden administration, and sort of going at these two particular targets to obviously have direct impact for the two of them as individuals, but also to send that signal sort of messaging wise. We're not sort of just giving we're not giving sort of blanket approval and a pass to everybody who is on the Ansarallah side here to do as you will, and to sort of foment violence and to do the bidding of the Iranians perhaps. We're not gonna abide that, but if we come after you, it's going to be in a more targeted way. So I think that it's an interesting illustration of sort of that big shift, because I think it is just fundamentally a shift in approach that we're seeing here.
It's a great laboratory study of the shift in approach, because I think that it was pure signal sending, this move, because it was lest you read our earlier actions removing Ansarallah from the FTO list and from the SDN list as support for Ansarallah. Don't be fooled. We understand that there are, that this organization and individuals in it are doing some bad stuff of which we do not approve, and we don't approve of the Iranian side of this civil war any more than we approve of the other side. And so I think this allowed them to send that signal, but without completely disrupting humanitarian aid in Yemen, because putting Ansarallah on those lists made it very difficult for any sort of commerce to take place in the areas in Yemen, the north part of Yemen, that Ansarallah controls. Whereas this sort of action sends the right signal, puts the worst of what the U.S. views as the wrongdoers onto the sanctions list, but is really, as a practical matter, not going to have any effect on the ability to do humanitarian transactions in Yemen, which the U.S. never, as a policy matter, wanted to interfere with. But the earlier action would have undoubtedly had that result, and this one clearly won't.
Right. No, agree with that. So with that, let's go to our last full topic here, which is a recent OFAC settlement with BitPay.
Let's talk about BitPay. And so BitPay is a company in Georgia that offers what they call a payment processing solution for merchants to accept digital currency. So it essentially makes it easier for merchants who want to allow their customers to pay in digital currency to do that. And so what could go wrong? So BitPay apparently had a compliance program and screened its merchants, and the merchants were not in sanctioned jurisdictions. But where OFAC felt that BitPay went wrong was that BitPay was not screening the customers of the merchants. And so essentially when they would allow the processing of these transactions, the payment transaction where the customer of the merchant would come and pay, there wasn't a process in place to screen and prevent the customers from being located in sanctioned regions. And so 2,100 times or 2,102 times, at least according to the OFAC investigation, BitPay's product allowed transactions to take place from individuals who were in sanctioned countries and were using digital currency to pay merchants for goods and services. So OFAC on February 18th imposed a $500,000 fine, $500,000 fine, which was substantially lower than it could have been based on a number of finding of mitigating circumstances, but was still a relatively significant fine on BitPay for these violations. And I think OFAC was trying to send two messages with this enforcement action. I mean, the first is that they wanted to emphasize the OFAC obligations of financial services providers in the digital currency sphere. So this was a little bit about sending a message to the digital currency sector that you're going to be treated like other financial institutions, and you're going to have to screen transactions to make sure that the transactions that your system processes are not coming from sanctioned jurisdictions. I think the second message that OFAC was trying to send in terms of those digital currency providers is that the risks that are involved in those transactions go beyond just the merchants that you're dealing with. And so to the extent that you have a product that is going to facilitate transactions between the merchants and somebody else, your compliance job goes a little bit further than that. And so, not a huge fine, not a really surprising, set of facts, because I think this happens in lots of different industries. But I think the reason that BitPay was kind of picked out for an enforcement action and a settlement and one of the web notices was because it was in the industry that OFAC really wanted to send a message to.
Yeah, I agree with those 2 points, and I have one additional one to add, which is, well, before I get to that, I think just on your second point about, I think the point there on screening of merchants, but perhaps not the realization that the customers of those merchants are also fair game for a company like BitPay to have been screening. We get questions like that a lot, which is like, well, can't we just rely on, if we screen to one level, do we need to screen another level? Like how far down the rabbit hole do we have to go? And I think as this shows, and as there was a settlement last year, Amazon was involved in, and there's more of these in sort of the that are kind of typical and representative of just the way digital commerce, e-commerce works. I think the answer is, of course, it depends, but I think you have to be thinking about your own risk beyond just who your direct customer is. I think that there's no question about that. And you can't just say, well, we onboard them, we screen them then, our merchants, and then we don't have to worry about it. I think the clear message here is that's not the case. You can't necessarily make that assumption. You might have to look and understand whether there is more you should be doing. And then I think the related point there, which is really the other point I want to make, is data. If you have data that you collect or that you are privy to that lets you know that IP addresses, email addresses, other signals that suggest to you, or that upon any kind of scrutiny would suggest to you that you might be ultimately facilitating or allowing transactions to occur in sanctioned jurisdictions. And here, in this case, there were basically all of them, all of the kind of classic ones, Crimea, Syria, Cuba, all of them were sort of were part of this. Again, you are going to potentially be chargeable for knowing that. If you have, that is essentially knowledge. You essentially have knowledge at that point that you may be facilitating business with those countries, and you need to be able to screen for that. You need to be able to do something about that. You can't just have that repository of data and never look at it, and you can't have you can't sort of bury your head in the sand on that. And, so that's one reason that many companies have started to be obviously very careful about what they are collecting. There's a whole host of reasons, privacy and otherwise, about why you may or may not want to collect data. But certainly if you have this data or you have access to this data, especially IP data, that would give you an easy roadmap to potentially reveal countries of concern where you might be doing business or facilitating business. If you're a U.S. company, you have to know that. You have to know that, and you have to be able to manage that risk, because I think that's another kind of lesson here.
Yeah, I mean, that was a big part of OFAC's analysis, is that BitPay was collecting this information, and they even kind of had time frames for it. For a while,
Yep.
BitPay was collecting information that included addresses, but then in November 2017, they started to collect IP addresses, which would have been able to tell you pretty quickly where the buyers were located. And so that was a factor here, is that BitPay had the information on which it could have acted and just didn't do anything with it.
Yeah, exactly. So with that, I think that that wraps us up for the main portion of the pod today, and we will pause for the lightning round sound effect. And two topics on the lightning round for today. Both will be, I think, pretty quick. First one is one that we touched on a few episodes ago, relating to the ICTS supply chain interim final rule that had been introduced in the waning hours of the Trump administration. At the time, we sort of speculated, and again, I'm not going to revisit that because it's pretty detailed and pretty complicated, but we did speculate and wonder whether or not the incoming administration, and this falls under the Commerce Department to sort of implement this, whether the incoming team at Commerce was going to keep this, or whether they would revisit it or amend it. This executive order that is the basis for this was put in place quite a while ago, so we're now almost 2 years since that was rolled out. And the interim final rule, obviously, there's a lot of different ways that could go. As we discussed at the time, there's potentially a licensing regime aspect to this that is yet to be defined. It covers certain transactions with foreign adversaries, notably, of course, China, Russia, and so a lot of different ways that the new administration could go with that. Based on the comments that have been made recently, it seems that the Commerce Department is going to stick with the final rule, the interim final rule. We're still in the comment period. The comment period, I believe, closes in about 2 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks later in March. So companies and other interested individuals are still free to make comments, but it certainly does seem like this ICTS supply chain interim final rule will perhaps largely stay intact and will be the framework to work from. I think there are some who, now I should add as just a quick bit of context, there have been many leading voices in the business community, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and many of the groups that align with the Chamber, who have come out and said, we hate this rule. We don't like this rule. It's going to be unworkable. It's going to be just hugely detrimental to sort of U.S. Economic interests, and we really think you should rethink this, Biden administration. Again, the signals now seem to be that is not going to be the case. There's obviously, after the comment period, there could be some things that will change. I think there likely will be, but it doesn't look like this is going to get thrown out. And there will be a sort of starting over, at least. That's kind of where we are now. I should also add, just this week, just 2 days ago, I believe, there is now finally a new Secretary of Commerce. Gina Raimondo was confirmed after a minor kerfuffle relating to her comments and promises with respect to whether Huawei was going to stay on the entity list during her confirmation hearing, but it sort of got past that and was overwhelmingly confirmed in the Senate just a couple days ago. So there is now a political, a Senate-confirmed political appointee at the head of the Commerce Department. And so I would expect in the coming weeks, as the leadership team starts filling in and as she is now kind of in place, that we will see more on this and more on a few of the other matters that are under Commerce's umbrella that we have touched on in the past. Will maybe start to chug forward a little bit further. So I'll leave it at that and throw it to Tim for any quick
Yeah,
comments.
just a couple of quick comments. I mean, the first one is to just emphasize that comments can still be made to this through March 22nd. So basically, we've got this open comment period. The proposal itself is very broad, but it also could be very narrow. So Commerce has a lot of ability to make of this what it wants. It could be very targeted, it could be very broad, and we just don't know where that will go. I think now that there is a Secretary of Commerce, Raimondo, who, as you said, got confirmed overwhelmingly despite some hiccups, and her team will now be going into place. I think the fact that they didn't do away with it entirely is important, but I think we will find out a lot more going forward about what this rule looks like and whether it's going to be more narrowly targeted than I think probably the prior administration would have made it, or whether it's going to be a broad rule that really does change the supply chain to quite a significant extent, and one that really would earn the ire of the business community in the U.S.
Yeah, and I think one last final comment on that, to sort of bring it back to China, of course, is I think everybody understands very well that this is primarily targeted at China and sort of disrupting the ability of China and Chinese companies to sort of further, ingrain themselves in the ICTS supply chain in the U.S. And to the extent that there is any perceived walking away from that or easing of that, I think that is almost a politically unpalatable thing to do at this point. We have said obviously that there are a number of other things, WeChat and TikTok, which we talked about the last time, which maybe the Biden administration is going to rethink and perhaps take a fairly different tact on, but those are very targeted, right? Those are just specific companies that are very kind of targeted things. This is as Tim said, potential to be very broad and hugely consequential. And so I think just scrapping this or really, kind of neutering it doesn't seem all that likely. And now it seems has been confirmed that that is not going to be the case. And so again, scope, tone, how it's applied, how it's implemented, what type of licensing regime we see underneath are all kind of TBD, but it does look like this is here to stay, at least as of the recording of the pod. So something to keep an eye on, and I'm sure we will come back to this when we do get more clarity on sort of what this rule is really going to be in practice. And with that, let's move to our final lightning round topic, which is we love any excuse we have to talk about Cuba. So we're going to talk about the recently introduced U.S. Cuba Trade Act.
Well, and really for the last year, the first 24 episodes, we've really talked about, ever tightening the sanctions on Cuba. The embargo on Cuba has been in place longer than either of us has been in place. And longer than President Castro was alive and is still in place. And much of the authority for the Cuba embargo is statutory and specific statutory authorities that really restrict the ability of the president to lift the Cuba sanctions. And in particular, they tie the hands of the ability of the president to allow U.S. persons to travel to Cuba for tourism purposes. And so, that when we talked earlier about, the susceptibility of a country to sanctions, Cuba is in some sense susceptible to sanctions because of the tourism industry. It's so close to the U.S. and such an obviously desirable tourist site that that has been the heart of the U.S. embargo against Cuba for quite a while. So in early February, as you pointed out, Brian, Senator Wyden, who is the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, introduced with a number of, and at least from what I can tell, all of the sponsors are Democrats, but introduced the U.S. Cuba Trade Act of 2021. And the press release pointed out how old the embargo was and called it it was outdated, harmful, and a failure of American leadership. In any event, the U.S. Cuba Trade Act would essentially undo the embargo against Cuba. And so it has a number of provisions. The main provision repeals all of the statutory authority for the Cuba embargo. So essentially all of the laws that support the embargo are repealed in terms of authority for the embargo. It then goes on to allow some portions of the embargo to be reinstated if the president desires that, but under the normal sanctions authority. So under IEPA, the president could potentially impose some of the sanctions again if he or she wanted to, but it rules out certain areas for sanctions, and most importantly, telecommunications equipment and facilities are placed off limits, and then travel. So it makes the U.S. sanctions policy towards Cuba much more similar to the sanctions policy for other embargo countries. And that's part of the reason that it would use IEPA as the statutory authority, because IEPA has a provision that essentially puts travel by U.S. persons outside of sanctions normally. And so it has a section that said, travel to and from Cuba by individuals who are citizens or residents of the United States may not be regulated or prohibited if that travel would be lawful in the United States. So that would be a huge, huge, huge change. Has some provisions about negotiating claims against by U.S. nationals, so essentially Cuban expats, for the taking of property at the time of the Castro Revolution, and then essentially says that it's the sense of the Congress that Cuba trade ought to be similar to trade with the rest of the countries in Latin America, and so has some reporting provisions and that sort of thing. So it would be a huge, huge change in Cuba policy. How likely is this to pass? Well, I pointed out that all of the sponsors are Democrats. In a 50-50 Senate, it seems like you would need more than that. You wouldn't technically need more than that, but unless you could get Democratic unanimity plus Vice President Harris to break any ties if the Republicans were unanimous as well. It seems like they're going to need more than a few Democratic sponsors, but it is the chair of the Finance Committee. Some of the other Democrats who are on board are pretty long-standing Washington veterans and pretty high up in the Senate Democratic hierarchy. So maybe it has a chance. It certainly has gotten further than you would think already in terms of its being introduced on the floor of the Senate and by the chair of one of the relevant committees.
Yeah, so I'll only add a couple of thoughts there. I think largely we wanted to cover this as more of a thought exercise than anything. I don't know that we think it's sort of high likelihood that this is going to really get momentum and get passed, sort of as things are currently constituted in the Senate or the House. I would note that there was a very similar, and I haven't done a kind of side-by-side comparison, but there was a very similar bill that was introduced in 2017, I think at the very beginning of the Trump administration, in both the House and the Senate, and that actually had some bipartisan sponsors and support for it. And so it's not out of the question that you could see Republican support for something like this. Of course, Senator Rubio and others who are vehement opponents of any lessening of sanctions on Cuba would I'm sure be leading voices trying to sort of shout that down and keep their party in line. But that is something to consider. I also think that obviously we have talked a lot about the idea that that President Biden has indicated he does want to sort of revert, at least at a minimum, probably to sort of Obama era Cuba policy and Cuba sanctions policy, and sort of undo many of the things that the Trump administration put back in place or put in place anew over the last few years. So obviously he has a lot of leeway to do that just through executive order and other things, and OFAC could obviously change the Cuba regs in a number of ways to allow for those types of things. But I think it is a fascinating exercise to think about some a bill that would kind of just be a grand stroke with a stroke of the pen. You would sort of undo all of this and basically reset everything on the Cuba sanctions front. I don't know at this point, looking into the crystal ball. Unlike the whiskey tariffs and JCPOA 2.0, I don't necessarily think that I would put this at a high likelihood that come late this year we're going to be talking about the end of the Cuba embargo by through passage of this bill or something similar. But nevertheless, I think we thought it was useful to just throw it out there, and I don't know that it got a ton of attention, but it is kicking around now. It's been introduced. We'll see if anything comes of it, but just something.
Well, I mean, the one
put on the radar.
Right. The one final thought I'd have on it. I mean, it doesn't seem likely to pass, but this is the only way the Cuba embargo is really going to end, because Congress has legislated it. And so, presidents can tinker at the margins, as both President Obama and President Trump did, and President Biden can come back in and tinker at the margins again and kind of push us back to where you kind of had travel that was for tourism, even though as a legal matter, it was illegal to travel to Cuba for tourism. But there's no, at least under the current state of the law, there's only so much a president can do, and if this is going to get really fundamentally changed, it's going to have to be Congress that does it. I doubt there's going to be the political will to do it now, but at some point, I would guess that you're going to have a bill that looks something like this that gets through Congress, but when is a much more difficult question to answer.
Yeah, we may be on episode like 425 of Embargoed by the time we get to that. So the way we're going. So with that, that concludes the lightning round, and that concludes the show for today. So again, as always, thank you to everyone for joining. We appreciate it. We will be back in 2 weeks in sort of late March for another episode. Unclear, I think, whether I think it's unlikely that'll be an episode with guests, but yeah, never say never. We may be sort of more to a standard format, or perhaps we might be due for another all lightning round episode at some point soon again. So
sometimes there are surprises. We have to keep the surprise factor out there for the next time.
We could have another coup in the next 10 days that will bump up to the top of the list of things to talk about. So we'll for all of our sake, we'll keep our fingers crossed that's not the case. But we have to always be ready here to jump on the latest and the greatest. So with that, thanks to everybody, and until next time, stay safe and stay sanctions free.
Thanks a lot, everybody. Stay sanctions free.